All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Let's Get Banned. I'm about to hop on a plane in a few hours, but with that being said, I did not want to go, I guess you could say, contentless this evening without at least posting something for you guys. So, today's episode is called Matrix Codes, Dead Internet Theory, and I think the Rigelian ETs are suppressing disclosure. Why do I bring that up? So, first off, let's take a look at what the Dead Internet Theory is for those who don't know. I'm just going to go over it very quickly. We're going to do a quick comparison of what the mainstream media tends to define it as compared to what it is more realistically. So, and according to The Atlantic, and I quote, Dead Internet Theory suggests that the internet has been almost entirely taken over by artificial intelligence. Like lots of other online conspiracy theories, the audience for this one is growing because of discussion led by a mix of true believers, sarcastic trolls, and idly curious lovers of chit-chat. Now, before I go on, I just want to say this generally tends to be the case in which how certain, I don't want to use the word conspiracy theories, but how certain theories or proposals tend to arise, which then gives traction to that of the mainstream media to attempt to discredit it down the road. With that being said, let's take a look. It says right here, one might, for example, point to @Capricorn, a Twitter account with what looks like a blue orb with a pink spot in the middle, as a profile picture. In the spring, the account tweeted, I hate texting, come over and cuddle me. And then it tweeted, I hate texting, I just want to hug you. And then I hate texting, just come live with me. And then I hate texting, I just want to kiss you, which got 1,300 likes, but didn't perform as well as it did for @It'sPureLove. All right. Anyways. It says here at the end, person or bot, does it really matter, end quote. Now, let's jump very quickly to this website right here, america.org. And I quote, the internet thrived because it was decentralized, lacking a center or controlling authority. Starting with the rise of smartphones in 2007, it became increasingly centralized to the point where 6 companies, by the way, control its content and seem to be colluding on ideological imperatives. This gave rise to the dead internet theory. It is a loose term used to describe a range of change and oddities in the structure and content of the internet, which have become increasingly prevalent in the last decade, end quote. Now, before I go on to list the bullet points, I want to make something very clear here. When they mention in this particular section of the paragraph with regards to the content of the internet, to me personally, guys, I gotta be honest, the only way I think content is being, part of my English, fucked with is if it's being censored, removed, or if there are certain, corporate interests that are funding independent podcasters or something like this in order to push a certain narrative. I think it's as simple as that. I mean, the execution is a little more complex in the overall operation, but what I want to focus on here is, and I quote, a range of changes and oddities in the structure of the internet. Okay, end quote. Why do I bring that up? Because you can do a simple Google search. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is quite prevalent these days. Many quantum physicists are finding, believe it or not, that there is a deep connection between the composition of the World Wide Web, the internet that, humans allegedly created, and the universe, trying to understand what makes up the universe. Now, here's what's also interesting as well. There's a lot of people over the years that have the subscription to the fact that you can actually catch a computer virus. Now, a lot of people have been saying, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about? And all that kind of stuff, right? Well, with that being said, I want to bring up something. I want to point to something quite significant in my opinion. And it has to do with this right here. Take a look at this, ancientcode.com. All right, now some of you who have watched actually the Gaia or Ancient Aliens will know about these pyramids. However, an ancient city that resembles a circuit board when viewed from above. All right, Teotihuacan, excuse me if I butcher that, the city of the gods. Now, let's take a look at this particular image right here. Okay, this is this is a circuit, right? Now, let's take a look at this right here. You see that right there, folks? Do you see the similarities? Now, the question then becomes, is there in fact some type of correlation between the way in which the internet was developed corresponding to that of the actual composition of the internet from a software or hardware point? And the reason I bring this up is because Colonel Philip Corso said on one of his deathbed interviews, and I quote, we didn't do even 10% of what we were supposed to do when examining those bodies and the craft. End quote. However, he then went on to say he believed for a fact that things like Kevlar, the integrated circuit, fiber optics, all came from reverse engineering the Roswell craft. So the question then becomes, we look at these pieces, right? They sort of seem all over the place. They seem scattered because there's no, centralized database sort of to assemble this. There's no UFO, hotline or 911 to call when, or something like this when you have a question about these things. So when we put the pieces together, could it be possible that through The correlation between the design of these pyramids using maybe piezoelectricity to generate energy or something of the sort, could it be possible that this correlation is ingrained within the dimension of the universe that we live in, which is how the internet was able to be established using a very basic form of energy, electromagnetics, frequencies, and things like this? And for those that are saying, Dave, what are you talking about? Well, if we go back to the time of Xerox PARC in Silicon Valley, you'll see that that is how a lot of the forms of computers at the time were correlated, connected, and corresponded. It was much more of a hardware, I guess you could say, execution of building and developing rather than that of a software one, whereas today it's kind of switched. The hardware seems to be, constantly evolving at a very steady rate, but the software is the soul of it. Again, you see the connection, the soul, the hardware, very similar to how the human body is allegedly a shell, right? And our soul is sort of like the software, if you want to call it. Now, the reason why I believe that the Rigelians are actually suppressing disclosure is because of this right here. Let's take a look at bibliotecaplades.net. Again, a great indexing website. So we're going to see here, we're on the page of the Blue Planet PDF document discussing different alien species. Now, these are called the Rigelians, also called malevolent alien life form. Okay, now the typical malevolent alien life form as represented thus far can be described as follows: between 3 to 5 feet in height, erect standing bipedal, small build, head larger than normal, absence of auditory lobes, absence of body hair, things like that. End quote. Before I go on, let's get a bit of a better visual, excuse me, because this is a pretty good drawing, don't get me wrong, but it is an illustration, right? However, this is an illustration as well. This is a Rigelian from a Star Trek online wiki. Now, the reason I bring this up is to show you the simplicity of the drop feeding of content that these Rigelians may be responsible for when disseminating some of this information into the public domain. Case in point, Star Trek, this, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even up to today. However, the Rigelians allegedly look like this. Right? With that being said, it's hard to say, this is an illustration as well, don't get me wrong, but it's hard to say if this species is the exact same as this particular gray species right here. This is quite a popular picture. Allegedly, this is a gray alien, alleged Rigelian, that is going to a place in which they have to sort of check into every time they arrive on Earth. However, this is the form of deception in which they use to make it seem like humans are still in control. So the question then becomes, okay, this right over here, which I want to tie back to. This is according to NewYorkDailyNews.com. And I quote, "In the genes, 7th grader says bloodlines of 42 of 43 U.S. presidents link back to King John of England." Okay, let's take a look. A young California girl made the ultimate presidential family tree and found that all of the U.S. commander-in-chiefs, except for one, share an ancestor, King John of England. All right? They all have the trait of wanting power, the 12-year-old told the local television station, end quote. Now, I'm not trying to get into, reptilians, royal bloodlines, things like this. However, if the Rigelians, in correspondence with the alleged Orion Dracos, Zeta Reticulans, and the reptilians, have all made some form of an agreement on this planet to coexist in a way that would allow for the curation and control of the geopolitical environment within a human level to be infiltrated. Again, like I said in the last Let's Get Banned, who is to say they're not currently infiltrating already? I'm not trying to fearmonger, but again, we got to be realistic and we have to consider all of the options. Now, let's jump back to bibliotecaplades.net, and I want to bring this up because this actually substantiates a lot of other evidence throughout my research that has supported this too. So clearly there seems to be some form of truth seeping through the cracks, if you want to call it, but again, I could still be wrong. This is all about expanding our perception. Let's take a look, and I quote, "The original contact between the government and the EBEs, who normally are gray in color and about 3.5 to 4.5 feet high, and coming from the Rigel star system, hereafter referred to as the Greys, was achieved between 1947 and 1971. They knew that the Greys were instrumental in performing the mutilation of animals as well as some humans, and that they were using the glandular substances derived from these materials for food, absorbed through their skin, and to clone more Greys in their underground laboratory." End quote. Before I go on, again, the alleged leaked pictures of, the purple pods, at least it seemed to be purple. Maybe that was the reflection of the particular camera that took that photograph, but we could see that the evidence is there to suggest this. And again, the gray aliens, generally speaking, not all of them, because there are different species. I don't want to summarize them and put them all into one big bucket, if you will, but allegedly they are closer to a more denser physical dimension. And this is interesting because I wonder if the Rigelians are the ones that are suppressing disclosure due to the fact that mass consciousness has not reached a certain density that they want yet, and they need to keep adjusting mass consciousness. Now, with that being said, that doesn't mean, when I say density, that does not necessarily mean ascension. It may not necessarily mean descension either. It could mean, simply shifting, if you will. Now, let's take a look at this right here. The government insisted that the Greys provide them with a list that would be presented to the National Security Council. This list has never been completed. Through all this, the government thought that the Greys were basically tolerable creatures, although a bit distasteful. They presumed at the time that it was not unreasonable to assume that the public would and could get used to their presence. Between 1968 and 1969, a plan was formulated to make the public aware of their existence over the succeeding 20 years. This time period would culminate with a series of documentaries that would explain the history and intentions of the Greys, end quote. Now, it's interesting because, again, we take a look at the former Secretary General of the UN, who was allegedly abducted at the 11th hour, if you want to call it, by a certain faction of the military-industrial complex that used Project Mannequin to abduct the UN Secretary General to spook him with gray aliens. Could this have been a certain faction of the military-industrial complex that is aligned with the Rigelians? Because this UN Secretary General, had a bit of a brain fart there. This UN Secretary General was supposed to disclose extraterrestrials with Reagan in a speech from the White House, by the way. So let's take a look at this right here. The Greys assured the government that the real purpose of the abductions was for monitoring our civilization, and when they learned that the abductions were a lot more frequent and insidious than they were led to believe, the government became concerned. Their concern was also based on additional information regarding the purposes for abductions. By the time the government had found out the truth about the intentions of the Greys, the Greys, intended to stay here, where they always will stay in control of Earth. It was too late. The government, by mistake, had already sold out humanity. Not that it would have made any difference, because they were doing here what they were doing anyway. End quote. Interesting, right? Because if we look at the timing of when Valiant Thor allegedly arrived, and some of the pictures of Valiant Thor, the Stranger at the Pentagon book, as I believe it is referred to, this actually takes place, if I'm not mistaken, in the 60s and 70s. And Valiant Thor stayed with the Department of Defense officials and lived in the Pentagon, in a certain quarter of the Pentagon, for many, many years. Could it be possible that there was an attempt with the Venusians and the Ashtar High Command and the Galactic Federation to actually find a way to resist, or a loophole within the Galactic Federation to get around this sort of Rigelian, I guess you could say, species or Rigelian form of control? Now, the next thing I want to take a look at is this right here. Wikipedia, Milgram Experiment. The Milgram Experiment on Obedience to Authority Figures was a series of social psychology experiments conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram. They measured the willingness of study participants, men from a diverse range of occupations with varying levels of education, to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. All right? Participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a learner. These fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. The experiment found unexpectedly that a very high proportion of subjects would fully obey the instructions, albeit reluctantly. All right, end quote. Now, why do I bring this up? The Milgram Experiment has been pushed and disseminated to the point where we are not even being operated on anymore. We are the operation. You see what I'm saying here, folks? And so let's take a look at this article right here. This is from disclosurenews.it. Meet Planet Gore, the Great Quantum Transition. So, let's see this right here. And I quote, "Many galactic committee meetings concerning us are also held on Gore. It is there that representatives of friendly space civilizations develop programs of joint action. The Big Star family wants to share with us the best that they have. It includes technology, energy resources, social and programs designed for life in the fifth dimension, and even space fleet in case air traffic on Earth is suddenly disrupted by natural disasters," end quote. So why is this so significant? Why is this brought up so often? And why do I cite this particular website? Well, if we take a look, okay, at this quote right here, "The plane of rotation ecliptic around the sun makes an angle of only 16 degrees, 5 minutes with the Earth. The mass of the planet is 7% greater than the mass of the Earth. Its maximum diameter is 1.078, the equatorial diameter of our planet. Gore has 3 natural satellites. The diameter of the largest one is about 40% of the diameter of the moon," end quote. I bring this up because when we take a step back and we observe the forms in which there have been different American presidents that seem to control, through the use of NATO and different apparatuses, the global agenda, it seems quite obvious. And we look at the links back to the bloodlines, right? Going back to King John. Quite ironic that during King John's time was allegedly also the same time that the Vatican had quietly removed and censored the vast majority of the Bible, which, again, we now know, I believe King James III, or IV, if I'm not mistaken, is the most popular version of the Bible within Europe and the West these days, which, again, would be a successful operation by the Greys. Now, let's take a look at this right here. Silview.media. FOIA release. Remote mind control linked to DARPA's brain mapping in 2018. Now, this is so significant because it's not only about mind control, folks. It has to do with brain mapping and so many different other things. Now, I do want to mention as well, too, that, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, they've been known to be quite controversial. But let's take a look at this right here. As part of a request for records on Antifa and white supremacist groups, WSFC inadvertently bundles in electromagnetic effects on human body.zip, end quote. So, believe it or not, folks, I'm not trying to get political here, but the fact that there was a push by the mainstream media to be able to try to disseminate and discredit conservatives in general, and I'm not trying to take sides, but we got to call things like they are. Conservatives are being attacked more than liberals these days, and look, let's call it like it is, right? So when we take a look at this, could it be possible that this mistake that was leaked within this accidental FOIA request, this file that was put in there, could it have been a form of drop feeding by someone inside the deep state of the military-industrial complex trying to get this out there? Very possible. Could it be a form of drop feeding by the Rigelians? Very possible as well. However, what I find to be quite equally as interesting is that if this was not a form of drop feeding by the Rigelians, if the Rigelians, believe it or not, were actually, I guess you could say, so malevolent and so negatively oriented, it is possible that because of the case that free will cannot be bent, this was actually a form of, I guess you could call, karma for us to sort of get a grip on what's happening with the Rigelians' control over the military-industrial complex. I am not saying that's what it is. I have no evidence to back up any of my proposals that I've just recently listed. However, let's also understand the connections when we see them and look at the evidence that supports some of the things we're discussing here, right? So take a look at this right here. All right, so excuse me, my apologies. This is thanks to our Patreon member, Joshua. Joshua, thank you so much, brother. These here are alleged matrix codes, and not light codes, but matrix codes. Now, light codes are allegedly, symbols and things like this that you see when you look up in the sky. Some people see them in different places within the environment, you name it, right? However, when we take a look at some of these numbers, these are alleged numerical codes that are used, and you're going to see how this comes full circle, by the way, that are used when it comes to human issues. These are frequencies used by a particular machine. I can't say it, but we'll talk more about this on Patreon in the upcoming members episode. These are matrix codes that correspond directly with that of what quantum physicists are studying that make up the composition of the internet, which is relative because, again, they're finding similarities between the code composition of the internet and space-time. So, again, I'm not making this stuff up, folks. This is, all mainstream media, if you will. And this is quite interesting and quite particular. Now, why do I bring this up? Could it be possible that the Rigelians are using artificial intelligence through the internet in a form, not of piezoelectricity, in a much more modernized frequential form, using the human military to disseminate many different forms of operations? Now, let's jump back to this right here, America.org. I apologize, I did not explain the bullet points earlier. The dead internet theory includes a massive increase in bots, including the idea that their presence and activity may now be far greater than that of actual people, or at least to a much greater extent than people have been led to believe. The homogenization and centralization of online content, the death of a once rich landscape of smaller communities dedicated to a vast array of subjects, hobbies, niches, all now replaced primarily by disorganized, impermanent, and easily controlled discussion on platforms like Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, etc. The idea that AI, considerably more advanced at present than we have been led to believe, is being utilized online for subversive or malevolent purposes, including the creation of increasingly bland and mindless media of the modern world, end quote. This is significant because bots may be disseminated, yes, of course, by the CIA, of course, by MI6, of course, by, the Russians, the Mossad, you name it, of course, by the CCP. But again, are the Rigelians behind the CIA's infiltration utilizing not only these bots, but artificial intelligence in order to get a grasp on the shift of direction of mass consciousness? I don't mean to keep harping on the whole concept of mass consciousness, but I also think it's very important that we cover it as well, and we understand that this may in fact be the end game to a certain extent, or to a certain goal, if you want to call it, a certain objective. Now, this is a tweet from a random account called Radiant1777. It really made me think, folks, and I just want to read this for you guys. Again, I'm not reading this like it is fact. Just take it with a grain of salt, but take this into consideration. Autism is not a disease. What you are going through, what you are experiencing as an autistic individual, these are natural in a high-frequency resonating being while existing in a world as dense as Earth. Do you understand? This is also due to the soul's choice to not integrate more of its energy spectrum in the 3D realm, for the physical body cannot handle it. Okay, end quote. Interesting that, again, the Greys, being as malevolent as they are, are allegedly the species that is the closest to this current third or fourth dimensional density. Could it be they are trying to prevent an increase in density from humans at a mass consciousness level because of their intention? And could it be possible that if Eisenhower had signed in the 1954 Greada Treaty a much stronger deal with a different species, things might be very different? We could be living amongst aliens right now. And I'm genuinely serious. It's interesting to see. Anyways, for the physical body cannot handle it. The physical brain is unable to keep up with the spiritual mind's frequency, so the 3D version of you may struggle to make sense of the energy in slow 3D wave patterns. Now, end quote. I have no science to back this up, folks. I'm just being completely truthful with all of you. However, when we take a look at some of what former Russian generals said about tuning the human brain without using any drugs, any technology, any external apparatus, okay, or paraphernalia of any kind, tuning the human brain to a certain energy contour, it makes sense. It sounds about right. You see what I'm saying? So again, I'm not saying that there's one species that controls this whole planet. I think there's one species that controls different factions of the most powerful nation on this planet that is helping the Greys redirect mass consciousness. And again, this probably doesn't matter to other alien species so long as we don't drop nukes, we don't do anything of the sort in any other way, I guess you could say, right? So with that being said, I would like all of you to let me know what you think, and we will talk to you we'll see you very, very soon. Cheers.